Hey, it's Tim Frisch with A Frisch Perspective here. In this video, we're going to be looking at the question, is the New American Standard Bible the most literal translation? Before we get started with this topic, make sure that you subscribe to this channel if you would like to watch more analysis, reviews, and fun from a Christian nerd's point of view. So if you look online for Bible translation charts, you'll find charts like this, where on one side they have word-for-word translations, and then on the other side they have paraphrase, and somewhere in between they have thought for thought. And as you can see here, there's a lot of different translations listed out. This is just one example that I found on the internet. And what you notice is way on the word-for-word side, all the way to the left, is the New American Standard Bible. So what this is saying or implying is that the New American Standard Bible is the most word-for-word or literal translation that we have in the English language. And that is a common thing that you see with these charts. I'll show you another one here. And in this one, I mean, you have a lot of translations here, a lot of different ones to look at. And it looks to me like the New American Standard Bible is the most word-for-word other than one other translation, which is the Lexham English Bible. Not as well known of a translation, and then beyond that is the interlinear, which is really just taking the Hebrew and Greek and putting it straight into English without changing anything in terms of word order or nuance. So once again, you have the New American Standard Bible seen here as the most literal translation other than one other translation, but of all the major translations that you commonly see, the New American Standard Bible is looked at here as the most word for word, even more so than the King James and the New King James. And another chart here, now this is from Steadfast Bibles, and they do produce New American Standard Bibles, but if you look on this translation chart, way over on the word for word side, all the way to the left here, you have the New American Standard Bible. Again, implying that the New American Standard Bible is the most word-for-word, literal English translation of the Bible. Now, I do have to admit, when I see these charts, sometimes I do have a bit of a reaction, and I really question sometimes how accurate these charts really are. And I think the big question is, what criteria are you looking at when you say that something is literal? And one of the problems with these charts is they don't really tell us the criteria upon which they are basing their assessment. But over and over, we see the New American Standard Bible on these charts as being considered the most word for word. It's also touted as being a very literal translation. It's promoted that way. And so often you will hear people say that over and over. They will say the New American Standard Bible is the most literal English Bible translation. And so I really wanted to do a video and just ask, what are the criteria we're looking at when we call the NASB the most literal translation? I don't have like a vested interest in this one way or the other. This is just a legitimate, honest inquiry into this subject. I really want to understand it better. And if you have some thoughts on this, and I'm not really looking for, oh yeah, I think that the NASB is the most literal. I'd like to see specific examples of how it is more literal than other translations. Because of all these charts, they seem to be implying the same thing until you get to one chart that I want to look at here. And there may be others that disagree, but one that I noticed is by a well-known YouTuber, if you watch Bible translation videos, R. Grant Jones. And he has a translation continuum here. If we look at it more closely, I highly recommend looking at his channel to get a better understanding of translations and how they compare to each other. He does such a good job of looking in detail at translations. And what I love about this translation chart here is that he actually discloses the method that he used, the criteria that he was looking at, in which he made his assessment of how literal a translation is. And so if you look here, this is his method. He chose 200 New Testament verses at random. He used a random number generator to choose those verses. He compared 22 translations to the Greek, the King James and the New King James to the Textus Receptus, and he considered textual variants. he counted liberties, and then he divided the number of liberties by 100. And you can see the liberties he's talking about here that translations might have taken. Omitting a conjunction, replacing a pronoun with a proper name, changing a verb's tense, inserting text without italics, providing an explanation in the text, such as make us guilty of this man's blood, for bring this man's blood upon us, which would be more literal. And so what you see in this instance, and I do again like the fact that he tells us what he's looking at, is that the New American Standard Bible here, if we look at the 95 for example, it's actually not as literal as the King James or the New King James or the American Standard Version or the Revised Version. Actually, the NASB 95 is not even as literal, according to this assessment, as the NAS 20, the NAS 77, or the new coming out soon Legacy Standard Bible. But all of these editions of the New American Standard Bible, including the Legacy Standard Bible, on his chart are not as literal as the King James Version and the New King James Version. So I think it does bring up a question here. Is the New American Standard Bible truly the most literal Bible translation? Obviously, we have data here that would say if you look at it from certain criteria, you could say there are other translations in actuality that are more literal than the New American Standard Bible. So again, I'd like to hear in the comments what are some of the criteria that have been used to say that the New American Standard Bible is more literal than, for example, the New King James Version. Now, I would guess that some of that might have to do with word order of certain sentences, as well as the tense of verbs maybe, and the use of italics, things like that. But the New King James does use italics. I know too some people will point to footnotes, but I don't regard the footnotes as the translation. So if we were to take an extreme example and look at something like the New Living Translation, which clearly is not on the very literal side, even if the New Living Translation had a bunch of footnotes that said literally the Hebrew says this or literally the Greek says this, we still wouldn't say the New Living Translation is the most literal. We have to go by what's actually in the text. So that's where I tend to look at the text itself, and sometimes I find, and again, this is very anecdotal, but I definitely see instances where, for example, the New King James Version is more literal than the New American Standard Bible. And I noticed it specifically with certain expressions. So when we think of literal, we think that if there's an expression in the original language and we put it in English, we're going to get really the same choice of words from one language to another. But then when I looked here, for example, and this is just some things that I noticed, you might actually be able to provide me with some counter examples where the New American Standard Bible is more literal than the New King James in terms of how they translate expressions. But here it says, wherefore, having girded up the loins of your mind, and that is a literal translation, Young's literal translation, and we see that reflected in the New King James Version. Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind. So that seems to be pretty literal, what the New King James is saying there. But what do we read in the New American Standard Bible? And this is the 95 edition. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Now, they do have a footnote, gird the loins of your mind, but the text itself is not actually as literal there. So this is an example where an expression being translated in the New American Standard Bible is not as literal as the expression being translated in the New King James. And there are other examples too. Matthew chapter 6. Again, this is a literal translation here. Who of you being anxious is able to add to his age 1 cubit? Now the New King James says, which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? And then in the New American Standard Bible, it says, who of you by being worried can add a single hour to his life? Now it does have a footnote that says cubit there, but that's actually translated as cubit in the New King James Version. So again, I'm seeing another example here where the New King James is actually more literal than the New American Standard Bible. Another one would be Genesis 4:1. A lot of you are familiar with this expression in the Hebrew. In the literal translation, it says, the man knew Eve his wife. In the New King James, it says, now Adam knew Eve his wife. And then in the New American Standard, it says, now the man had relations with his wife Eve. And of course, again, we have a footnote that says literally knew. So the New King James there, once again, is more literal. Now, obviously, people will point to the footnotes as being, well, the New American Standard Bible is literal in the sense that it gives literal footnotes. But that's not the translation, that's the footnotes. Like I said about the New Living Translation, even if it had literal footnotes, that wouldn't make the translation itself literal. Now, one thing I will say about the New American Standard Bible, which is a lot like the New King James Version, it's a very transparent translation. That's the way that I would put it. So that when you're looking at different passages, even if it's not literally translated, you can go down to the footnotes and learn a lot from the footnotes. So in that sense, I would say it is a very transparent translation. Also with the use of italics, seeing where they use supplied words in English. It's a very transparent way of translating the Bible. And I think that's useful. I think it's good for study purposes to have one Bible available to you that you can study that is a transparent translation where you can look at good footnotes and you can see supplied words in English. But I also think that there's validity in having other translations that are more dynamic and take the original languages and express them in clearer ways in English. So when I go back to these charts, I would have to say that it seems to me that maybe a better case that could be made for the New American Standard Bible in terms of how literal it is to say that perhaps it is the most literal of all of the modern translations. Because if you look at R. Grant Jones' chart here, these very literal translations are all historic old translations. The New King James Version is more recent, but it's really not a modern translation. It's what I would call a modernized translation. It's just updating the King James Version, which was based on the Textus Receptus. But of all the modern translations, I think a good case could be made that the New American Standard Bible is the most literal of those translations. And it's certainly a very transparent translation, as I talked about earlier. So those are some of my thoughts on this, and I think my takeaway is, one, I would love to see more charts out there explain what their criteria are for assessing how literal or dynamic a translation is. I would love to see more specifics rather than just making blanket statements that the New American Standard Bible is the most word for word, when I can clearly give you examples where it is not the most literal or word for word. I would also love for people to be more careful, too, in terms of how they frame this whole subject matter, and that we just be careful that we don't make an assumption based on something we've heard over and over, but we actually look at the specifics of it when we make a statement. So this is not to put down the New American Standard Bible. I think it's a very good study translation. I just question whether we can always say, hands down, that it's the most literal translation. I question that some based on R. Grant Jones and based on some of my anecdotal evidence as well. But I could be wrong in certain ways, or maybe I just need to understand what these other charts are based on and the criteria that other people are using. Again, I have a hunch that it has to do with word order, the syntax of sentences, maybe the consistency of certain word use and verb tenses, things like that. I understand that. But my one point of contention would be trying to say that footnotes, having literal footnotes, make the translation more literal. That I really don't agree with. Anyway, I'd like to hear some of your thoughts on this in the comments below. Add to my knowledge and to this whole discussion. I hope that you found this video interesting and helpful in some way. But thank you so much for taking some time to look at this subject with me from a Frisch Perspective.